In this video, we're going to look at another of the conditional structures available in Matlab called the switch structure. This is going to be similar to the if structure, but with some definite differences. So as I just mentioned, the switch structure is very similar to the if structure in that it allows us to choose from different sets of Matlab commands. However, the way the switch structure differs is that instead of asking a yes or no question and then making decisions based on the answer, we instead look at the value of a variable or a statement and then choose from different sets of possible answers. So here we see the basic syntax we have for the switch structure. You can see that we have a new keyword called switch, and then we also have a new keyword called case and otherwise. So let's look at how this one works. So in this case, we have switch, and then next to it we have switch variable. This is equivalent to the if and then our expression that we had with the if structures. So the switch variable is what is actually going to control which of the different sets of commands we execute. Okay, it could be a variable, it could be a constant, although it doesn't make much sense to have it be a constant, or it could be an expression as well, something that evaluates to a value. We then have a list of different cases. Okay, so those are specified by the case keyword. And next to each case, we then have what we call the case expression. Okay, so what the switch statement will do is it will take the value of whatever is in the switch variable location, and it will compare it against the values for each of these case expressions. If they are equal, then it will execute the Matlab commands associated with that case. Again, we can only execute one case at a time. We also have the otherwise case, which is similar to the else. So if Matlab goes through and looks at each of the cases and the value of the switch variable does not match any of the cases, it will then execute the commands associated with the otherwise case. So let's talk a little bit about what you can use as your cases. Pretty much you can use any type of value you want that's available within Matlab. For instance, you can use numbers, so you could use an integer number like case 1 and case 2, or you could use decimal numbers, so in this case, case 3.14159, which would be the value of pi, up to 5 decimal places. You can kind of get into some trouble if you use decimal places as your case values, because if Matlab is doing a computation, it may do some rounding and then the values won't be exactly the same. So I would caution you against trying to use decimal numbers. You can use characters, so we could have case, the letter lowercase a, or you could have case question mark. You can have strings, so we could actually test to see whether we want to have pizza or spam as different cases. And you can use trues and falses. In this case, it's not really that useful to use trues and falses in a switch case or in a switch structure, because basically you'd probably want to be using an if structure in that case, but it is possible. Really, the only thing that you can't use is a vector of values as the case for your switch structure. All right, so let's take a look at an example of a switch structure. However, to start out with, we're going to look at an example that we saw at the end of the if structure video. So here we have the example we saw where we're asking the user what the current day is. So we use a menu statement, what day is today, give them the options of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And then we saw we could have an if structure, which goes through and checks to see what button the user had pressed. If we were to transform this from the if structure, or in this case an if-elseif structure, into a switch structure, we would have the following code. All right, so again, the menu statement stays the same. We're still prompting the user, asking them to select which day it is. However, when we get to the actual structure, which decides what's going to happen, right, we now see that we have our switch keyword. Answer is now our case or our switch control variable. Okay. Then we have different cases, case 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which are the possible values that answer can take on. So if answer is equal to 1, then we would display today is not Monday. If answer was equal to 4, we would display today is not Thursday. Okay, so the switch statement compares the value of answer against the values for the different cases. If none of those cases were what was selected for answer, then it would run the otherwise case and would display, are you sure you entered a day? So now that we've seen what the switch structure looks like, let's talk a little bit about using it. So just like with the if structure, you don't need to have an else case. With the switch structure, you don't need to have an otherwise case. You can just have your regular set of cases. However, it's generally a good idea to have an otherwise case, and let's talk about why. So let's say you have the following situation. So you're writing your code, you need to allow the user to select from 3 different sets of code you want to be able to allow them to perform. Right, so you have an input statement and you ask them to type in the value of 1 for the first set of code, 2 for the second, and 3 for the third. Right, then you use a switch structure based on what the user typed in to select the appropriate set of code to execute. Right, if you look at that in Matlab, it might look something like this. So you have an input statement, you ask the user to type in a value, they type in that value, it gets stored into choice. Choice is then your switch control variable. And you have different cases based on what the value for choice is. So if the user typed in 1, you do whatever's in case 1, similarly for 2 or 3. But what happens if the user types in 5 or 10 or -2? You don't have a case to handle this, so what Matlab would do is would simply skip over the entirety of your switch statement. So what you could do instead is if you have that otherwise statement, then that can kind of be the catch-all for a mistake that the user might make. So in this case, if the user types in 5 or 10 or -2, it would display that is not a case, or you could have maybe an error message or something like that that pops up that tells the user, hey, you did something wrong, go back and try again. So what happens if you have multiple values that you want to have the same set of actions occur for? Well, in Matlab, you can actually do that with the switch statement. So as an example, let's go back to that idea of picking a day of the week. Okay, and let's say in this case, the only one that's correct is case 3. All the other ones just says today is not Monday or Tuesday or Thursday. Let's say instead we wanted to have it say that today is not the correct day, or that is correct. Okay, so we go through and change it and simply say case 1, that is not correct, case 2, that is not correct, and so on for the other cases. Then to have, so this would work if the user selected Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, or Friday, it would display that is not correct. If they selected Wednesday, then it would say that is correct. What you can do instead, though, is using the curly brackets, you can give it a set of values. So in this case, we have the set of 1, 2, 4, and 5. So if answer is equal to one of those values, 1, 2, 4, or 5, it will display that is not correct. If the answer is of value 3, so the user selected Wednesday, it would display that is correct. And if the user had somehow managed to get a different value, maybe they closed out of the menu box or something like that, it would display, are you sure you entered a day? Okay, so simply by taking your multiple case expressions and enclosing them in the curly brackets, it will allow you to have a single case or a single set of actions that occurs for multiple cases. Okay, so the last thing we need to talk about is when you should use an if structure and versus when you should use a switch structure. So always use an if structure when you have a range of values. So we went, for instance, if you wanted something to occur whenever x was less than 5. Okay. You want to use the if structure when you have a complex set of conditions. So if x is less than 5, but it's also greater than 2. So again, it's within some range of values. Or if you have multiple variables that you need to control with. So let's say you want to do something based on the value of variable x and of variable y. Okay. You use the switch statement when you have a specific set of values that you need to test over. So you have, for instance, a menu statement produces a variable. That variable can only have a certain set of values, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. That's a good use for the switch statement. All the conditions that you want to test can be satisfied with equal comparisons, okay, right? Because that is essentially what the switch statement is doing, is it's doing a bunch of equal comparisons. Does my control variable equal one of these cases? And you only have one variable to check, okay? So you can't set up a switch structure that's based off of multiple variables unless you perform some computation that results in a single value. Okay. Really, the kind of the rule of thumb is you can always use an if structure. So if you don't feel comfortable with the switch, you don't have to use the switch. You can always use the if. All right, but you should only use the switch when you have a finite set of possible values that your variable can take on. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. So hopefully you now have a little bit of an idea of how to use the switch structure as an alternative to using the if structure.